Scenestates is possibly one of the most across-the-board useful new tools inside of 3ds Max 7.5. What this tool does is it allows you to store the state of a scene and environment and then recall it back later, so you can have multiple states stored. Now in this particular environment I've got a scene which was originally modeled in Revit, and I then imported it through the File Link feature. And we've got one sunlight light outside beaming light in through the windows. So let's assume this is the state I want to start with. This is a good choice that I want. So we're just going to go into Manage Scene States, click Save, and you can see I have all the different chunks of data that can be stored in this. I'm going to take everything, and we're going to say Daylight, and click Save. So now daylight is stored in here. Now we can move on and create new states. So I'm just going to minimize this, go out to a top view. Let's grab that sun system, just pull it over to this side. I'll also grab this light here and we'll just turn it on. So now it's active and running. The sun system itself, let's just go and change the color of it as well. Let's say we're going more towards a sunset, something like so. Close that off. And if I jump back to my camera, you can see this light is now on, so I'm getting different lighting in the environment. It's in a new location on top of it. And the sun has also been moved and is beaming in a different color, so that's why I see the new color on the stairs. So if I go into Tools, Manage Scene States, and say Save, and we call this Sunset, it is stored. And now I can go back at any point and say Daylight, Restore. I can restore everything that's stored in Daylight or just pieces of it. Click Restore, and we go back to the original layout. You notice that light has moved, the sun has moved over, everything has changed. Now I can take this a lot further simply by going in and saying I want to create very unique states. So let's just say I want to go in and select all the geometry in this scene. So I'll just say All, Select. I'm going to go to my Materials Editor, and I've got a standard simple matte gray, which I'm then going to assign to my selection. So now everything's in a nice matte gray. Now I might want to do this whenever I'm tweaking lighting heavily and I don't want the distraction of texture maps to detract from the way the light is working in my scene. So I'll often go to gray to do my initial setups, my playing around. Also speeds up my rendering times. So now that everything's in a gray, I can again pull up my scene states, save that, and we'll call that matte gray, and hit save. So that's stored. And at any point I can always go back to my original with all the texture. So it's an easy way to go back and forth between different texture setups. So I can just say Restore, and it's all back. Now the beauty is, if I'm in matte gray doing lighting tweaking, once I've tweaked my lights, moved them around, changed all the settings, if I restored full daylight, all those settings would go away. They'd only be with the matte gray. But what I can now do is when I restore daylight, I can say restore everything except for the light transforms and the light properties, and say Restore, and it'll bring everything back but those bits. So now I've kept all those lighting tweaks I made while I was in the matte gray setup, and then I can restore this back down as daylight. So it makes a very powerful system when you're doing a lot of lighting tweaking and a lot of adjustment of your scene, those final tweaks that you make for rendering. Now if I was working in the games world, this would also be a very powerful tool if I'm doing a lot of render to texture work, because maybe I want to do render to texture work with daylight setups, nighttime setups, special effects setups, things like that. I can store all these scene states and call on them, do a render to texture, go to the next scene state, call on it, saving me having to have multiple max files that are all synchronized. So if I suddenly changed one thing, I don't have to remember to change it in 3 different max files. It's all stored in this one scene state. And again, of course, all of these same things apply to video and film production, where you might want to have multiple states you're trying out, testing, and working with. Alright, so that brings us around to Batch Render, which is the new tool that allows us to render off the various scene states automatically. So to deal with that, first thing I need is a couple different viewpoints just to show this off. So I've got camera 2 in the scene that I'm looking through, but it's the only camera. So what I'm going to do is go to a perspective view, use my walkthrough cam, and just quickly fly up onto the balcony. Let's say right about there is the view that I'm looking for, and I'm just going to broaden that view so we can see a little bit more of it. And now what I do is go into Create Cameras, Create Camera from View, and I've now created Camera 1, which is looking at the exact same spot that my walkthrough cam was looking. With that said, I can go into that Batch Render tool. Now in Batch Render, I can now add multiple events. So let's add Camera 1, the camera I just created. And with Camera 1, I'm going to go in and tell it you're going to use the daylight scene state, and you're going to use the Mental Ray Design Interior Rendering preset, which is one I created specifically for this environment. Then I can go and add another event. We'll add camera 2, and camera 2 is going to use the let's say sunset scene state with the Mental Ray Design Interior. And then I can go in and add, I can even render out from the perspective of a light, whatever I want to do. Once I've got all these different settings set, I can now choose how I'm going to render them. I could send it off to the network and have a net render across multiple machines. I could export this file to a .bat file, which will allow me to run it from a command line, or I can just render it here inside of Max and have them all happen one after the other. So that's what we're going to choose. So I just click Render, say OK. So now it's started Mental Ray up. It's currently rendering off the first scene, which would be the camera 1 view looking down from the balcony. You can see it, there it is. Now the beauty of this, of course, is it allows me to set off very large, complicated renders with multiple different options all at once. So instead of setting up a whole bunch of settings and hitting render, waiting for it to finish, then changing the settings, hitting render, waiting for it to finish, or setting up multiple Max files with all the settings in them, I can use the mix of scene states and batch render to do this all in one file. So this means I can now, for instance, if I'm doing poster shots, I could create 8 or 9 8K poster images, all with different lighting setups and different camera angles in one render. I just press that button and walk away and come back when it's done. It saves me having to babysit the entire process. So very, very powerful system.